New York City is home to the United Nations, where the countries of the world come to meet and discuss global issues. With recent reports pointing to the climate becoming more and more dire, can New York be a catalyst in the global climate action movement? I'm here in the city for Climate Week, and I want to know if it's just empty conversations and pep rallies, or if there's empowering progress that comes out on this road to Glasgow. Hi, I'm Shonagh Smith, and every year climate activists come to New York City as autumn begins, coinciding roughly with the UN General Assembly meetings. Organised by Climate Group, Climate Week NYC is a series of events, meetings, conferences and rallies that bring focus to the climate issues the world is facing. I started this road to Glasgow last spring in New York City when I learned about the importance nature has on the climate, that it's not just about carbon emissions. And I got to talk with Dr. Christian Samper, head of the Wildlife Conservation Society. In DC for the US Leaders Summit on Climate, I talked to experts who stressed the importance of the public and private sectors both working on lowering carbon emissions. And just recently, I visited Marseille, France, where the IUCN World Congress was being held. Honestly, I left France feeling a little puzzled. There seemed to be a lot of effort, talks, and voting on what I consider to be extremely minor things. But is that what needs to happen? Does it take tiny, insignificant steps in order to get further down the road to a cleaner climate and a healthier Earth? That's one of the answers I'll be seeking during Climate Week in New York City. The road to Glasgow is the path to the UN Council of the Parties, or COP, that happens annually, this year hosted by the UK and Italy and held in Glasgow, Scotland. A few times over the last 25 years, significant action has come out of the COP, like the Kyoto Protocols and the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is what is really the foundation of what will happen in Glasgow this year. It was just over 5 years ago and had 5-year commitments. Glasgow will be a reporting point of how the nations are doing. As I've walked around in New York City, it's apparent the security here is very tight. This week, many heads of state have visited the United Nations because the General Assembly is meeting. One of the first people I ran into was Nina Koncheva, who works for the United Nations Development Programme, specifically helping Indigenous peoples throughout the world. She was able to give me some insight on some key points to come out of the IUCN in Marseille.
At IUCN, Indigenous peoples achieved some important victories. One was to pass a resolution to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025. This is very, very important because it now gives Indigenous peoples an actual signed document that they can use for their advocacy and to negotiate and to keep pushing for this very important goal. Another resolution and another topic that had a lot of attention was something called the Sacred Headwaters Initiative. The Sacred Headwaters Initiative proposes to protect the territory, the very large territory between Ecuador and Peru at the source of the Amazon River that is a very sacred territory for Indigenous peoples. And that movement there to protect hundreds of thousands of hectares has also surfaced something important called the rights to nature. And that's something that Indigenous peoples have been talking about as well. It's the idea that nature has rights as well, that rivers and mountains have rights as well. So that's a very interesting topic of conversation that Indigenous peoples have helped surface as well.
Well, I'm here for Climate Week NYC, but what exactly is it? When the first one was held in 2009, it was a special event, a time to come together and stand out, to let the world know that there's a real problem and we need real solutions. And every year since, the event has continued. Climate Week NYC is run by Climate Group, and I got a chance to sit down with CEO Helen Clarkson to talk about its history.
So Climate Group is an international non-profit organisation, so we're mission-driven, and our mission is to drive climate action fast. When it was founded, it was all about making the case for climate action, persuading businesses and governments that there was a business case, that it wasn't something that was just about hippies, it was actually something businesses need to take seriously. And over the years, we've evolved quite a lot. So now we work with campaigns which are really about bringing together groups of businesses or governments with a commitment at the centre, working with them individually to deliver their goals, but also looking at the power of collective action. So if you've got 300 companies all with a commitment to renewable energy, that allows you to interact with policymakers and suppliers to really shift markets. Where we are with Climate Week NYC is it's vital to have it every year. There isn't enough attention, there isn't enough urgency in the world around Climate Week, and we try and make sure the theme is different every year. This year we're talking about getting it done and the need for action now on the climate. In the NGO world, I always think you should be trying to put yourself out of business because, you know, if you're mission driven, you want to solve problems. And so we'd look forward to the time when we don't need to have a Climate Week NYC, but at the moment it's still really vital to bring people together and to share that imperative for action and the urgency.
This is my first Climate Week NYC, and I really didn't know what to expect. But as I've looked over the events, talks and gatherings, many of them have virtual listed to the side. The pandemic is still a huge factor to overcome in getting people together for any global action. But is it all bad? Do people who might not have been able to attend now have the chance to log in and speak up? I got differing thoughts on this one.
It's a real mix. So last year was the first year we had to move the whole event online, and we hadn't done something like that. We knew we had to go early because we wanted it to look really good, we wanted it to be really engaging. And while we all missed the in-person networking and that thing of being in the room with other people, what we found is we could bring in more voices from around the world, and so that global element of participation was much stronger. And so where that's left us is we want Climate Week NYC going forward to still have its roots in New York. We still want to be there alongside UNGA, but we want to have more of this hybrid of global voices, that element of New York, and it's going to be a mixture going forward. And this year the opening ceremony was a mixture of people on stage and people we were beaming in. The hub all took place virtually, and in future I think we'll see a mix of events in the week.
Do you think the virtual events helped with inclusivity since they weren't able to be here in person?
I don't think they hurt. I just don't know if they help as much. From what I've heard from Indigenous leaders, there's nothing like being there in person. And I know this from my own experience as well. There's nothing like bumping into that government representative and having a quick word with them about this issue that we have to work on. So the kind of serendipity that happens when people are in person is not there with virtual events. But virtual events are better than nothing. Of course, they do encourage people can participate as long as they have internet connection, which is not a guaranteed thing for Indigenous peoples.
I sat down with the ambassador from Tonga about the challenges that the pandemic is causing for COP26.
For us in the Pacific, there is a predicament. Judging by my interaction with my capital, there is not a whole lot of optimism about them sending a delegation from capital too, because of the COVID-19. So we are the ones, we are the underdogs, we are the ones who really be there barking the moral voice. I don't know whether all of them will go to Glasgow. So it's a kind of an irony that it's the very meeting that we need to be there to make the moral voice be heard. And yet, the way I feel just by talking to some of my colleagues with respect to COP26, it's a big meeting, but I fear that maybe not all of the island countries will be there.
What is the IPCC report, and how does that document impact the global climate efforts? And what role do small island states play in all this? We'll find out when we return to the road to Glasgow. Is the climate really changing? Are our concerns for real? The United Nations set up a body to research this, to be able to give a scientific assessment on climate change, to tell us where we are, where we need to be, and how we might get there. The body is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, and they've created 6 comprehensive reports since their creation in 1988. The IPCC came out with a big report in October of 2019. What were your thoughts on that?
That was a really important report. And the report they did in 2019 was specifically requested by the UN, and they wanted to know what's the difference between 2 degrees of warming and 1.5 degrees C of warming. And the reason that's important is that the Paris Agreement said that all the world's governments would aim for under 2, but efforts towards 1.5. And so they were asking the scientists, okay, is there really a difference? What that report said is, yes, there's a huge difference between those two. And I think the way I always talk about it is, you know, if you look at the weather forecast for tomorrow and it was 0.5 degree hotter, you'd wear the same clothing, right? But actually all the world systems that they looked at, and they looked at things like the coral reefs, they looked at, you know, where can crops grow, what's happening, actually they even looked at things like tourism. And you could just see this fundamental difference to livelihoods, to all the things that could grow on the planet between 1.5 and 2. And it was this real wake-up call that we couldn't just aim for 2 degrees of warming, we needed to get as close to 1.5 degrees C as possible. And you saw that being built into everyone's targets. They also produced regular reports, and they did one of their regular reports this summer. That came out a month or 2 ago, and they talked about Code Red for humanity. So again, the IPCC really sounding alarm about the latest climate science. And it's worth remembering that as they go through the process of putting that report together, they debate every single line individually. And so in a way, that's, you know, they're not being alarmist there, they're kind of being minimalist in a funny way. And so it's really important to look at that report and take it very seriously.
With over 200 scientists, the data can be interpreted potentially 200 different ways. My takeaway from the IPCC reports is that these scientists are trying to reach a consensus to be able to give us the most accurate reading of where the world is and what the short-term future might hold. While politics is certainly frustrating to me, I am beginning to see why it's an important step towards achieving action. And speaking of politics, I've been surprised to learn here that an important group is the Alliance of Small Island States as a voting bloc in organisations like IUCN and the United Nations. This has led me back to Ambassador Tone of Tonga to find out more about the role small island states play on the front lines of climate change.
AOSIS is an acronym that stands for Alliance of Small Island Developing States. It's one of the groups here at the UN. It's one of our strengths to be in a group because on your own you're just an island in the ocean and you won't be able to do much. But member states come in, they congregate and work in groups, and AOSIS is one of those groups, and they have common issues, and that makes it very good for them to work together and push their agenda.
One issue facing the climate change efforts has been the blocking in the UN of the IPCC 1.5 degree report. A new movement has been started to push the report. Science, not silence.
Gearing to going to Glasgow, we don't want to see that happening again. Right. And of course, the latest report really shows a lot of negative impacts on the ocean and sea level rise and so forth. So we want that report to be welcome and widely accepted, not to go below 2 degrees, no, 1.5 degrees or less. Keep with that. So that's one thing, to make sure that there is support for that special report of the IPCC. And second is to encourage countries to submit new or revised NDCs to meet with the 1.5 degrees centigrade.
I learned a little bit about the struggles and challenges of Indigenous peoples at the IUCN meeting in Marseille, but what I'm finding here in New York City is even more buzz. How Indigenous peoples are examples of how to treat the earth and its resources, and how they've been taken advantage of by their own governments and need protection. A big focus of the UN right now.
Indigenous people's rights are not secure yet. Indigenous people's rights to self-determination or to land tenure or to have free, prior and informed consent. So all in all, you might know that in 2007, Indigenous peoples fought very hard to make sure that there's a declaration, that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is adopted at the UN. And The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples doesn't spell out any new rights. It compiles all the different rights that Indigenous peoples have, and it's a really incredible tool for Indigenous peoples to be able to negotiate at the global level with their governments to make sure that those rights are implemented on the ground level.
What's Climate Week NYC and the UN General Assembly without protests and marches? Even in the face of a worldwide pandemic, COVID-19 has not slowed down a lot of people from demonstrating their thoughts and ideas on the streets of New York City. More when we come back on the road to Glasgow. I'm here at the Climate March during Climate Week NYC. I'm encouraged to see all the young people getting involved. It's interesting to see the signs and the different issues and the incredible diversity, not just in people, but in ideas. But do some of the extreme positions help or hurt climate action? I'm trying to find out.
We need to respect Indigenous people's rights. We need to respect their land and respect the water that all of us need.
We need a governmental shift. We need some sort of thing to go out. We need some sort of legal law to go out that's getting us what we need. We need to lower our overall carbon emissions. We need to regulate a lot of different things that are regarding this. And frankly, what we're doing now isn't enough, and what's legal now isn't enough. We need more, and we need to push that, and that's why we're here today.
With the focus on Indigenous peoples, Manaria Shonagh caught my attention at the march. I wanted to know why he was marching and what his message to us is.
Porque también queremos cambiar la forma de ver a la selva. Hasta ahora, el mundo moderno a la selva ha visto como un recurso natural, pero nosotros queremos cambiar que ese recurso natural no es un recurso natural, sino son seres vivientes igual que nosotros. Entonces tenemos que entender eso para comenzar a vivir juntos.
All the energy and passion is great, no doubt. For me personally, I want to make sure all the effort leads to real change. The emergency is too close to be spinning our wheels on this road. The UN scans the whole world to find young leaders to represent the 17 global goals. The representative for the youth of the US is A.Y. Young, the first musician ever chosen. It's easy to see why the UN selected A.Y. for global goal number 7, sustainable energy and access to it. This guy is full of energy.
I started to use my passion, my music, the battery tour as a way to raise money to send one person, one village access to energy. Because I had actually learned through traveling America that, oh shoot, like 1 billion people, don't have access to energy. And that's actually, one of the sustainable development goals, is goal number 7. Right, so after connecting to the UN and I was nominated, I became one of these 17 United Nations young leaders for the Sustainable Development Goals.
The only one from the US.
And the only one from the US.
Wow.
So I mean, and these SCDs are like these 17 things that the United Nations is like, hey, we have to do this by 2030, right? Everyone should have electricity, everyone should have water, right? We should all have food, right? There should be no poverty, which is something that Global Citizen is helping on, right?
Right.
We should, and so there's the 17 things, and they picked me to be one of the 17. So Project 17 came to me in 30 seconds. Because I looked at the goals and I was like, okay, shoot, water, and I'm thinking about my passion, because I always talk about how everyone's an outlet, right? We're all outlets for change and plugged into each other. We can power, we can do anything. Learn who you are, figure out your why, and then you'll make change, right? Then you'll do it.
In looking for action, for solutions to the problem of a climate heading to the brink, I'm learning there are different ideas, different solutions being put forward. One of those solutions for keeping the temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius is a carbon market. But what is a carbon market? Basically, if you set a cap on carbon emissions, then a country not emitting much carbon can sell their extra carbon credits under the cap to a country that is pushing up over the cap. Some see this as a way to keep the greenhouse gases from getting worse, while opponents claim it simply gives the big emitters a way to keep polluting. I'm finding more and more talk about this because it's the last part of the Paris Agreement still under negotiation. And another reason it's controversial is because some countries, especially some big carbon emitters, are pushing for lax rules about how carbon and credits are calculated. It will be interesting to see what, if anything, is determined at Glasgow concerning the carbon market solution. And do carbon markets put an undue strain on Indigenous peoples? Already their land has been and is being taken away, resources removed, nature destroyed. Will carbon markets just be another way Indigenous peoples are taken advantage of?
It is a place where more polluting bodies, entities, countries, or private sector will be able to purchase carbon credits from less polluting countries or entities and be allowed to continue emitting because they own these credits. This has been seen as a solution to help us stay within the 2 degrees or even the 1.5. From the perspective of Indigenous peoples, I know they have issues with this solution because on the one hand, this solution is within the kind of like the capitalist market model, and Indigenous peoples in general have been left out of markets and haven't benefited. Not only have they not benefited, but markets have, in ways, the way they function, have taken advantage of Indigenous peoples' territories and lands, even rights. The other thing is that some Indigenous peoples believe that air has intrinsic value, it has spiritual value, it has value for everyone, for life. So it's not something to be traded. It's not something to put a dollar value on. It should be valued for its intrinsic value for life.
One thing I've learned here at Climate Week NYC that's really different from the IUCN in Marseille and the Leaders Summit on Climate in DC, there's a lot more activists in New York than politicians. And I'm not necessarily saying politicians are a bad thing. One thing I'm starting to realize, in order for real action to take place, we're going to have to find a consensus. And for that, extremism won't get the job done. We're going to have to find a way to protect our Earth. Instead of dividing, maybe a coming together of all people would be more productive. Easier said than done, I know. It's been an interesting Climate Week NYC. Carbon markets, UN meetings, and convergence of young people desiring real action. A strong step towards COP26. Next up, on our road to Glasgow, visiting the co-host country, Italy, for the pre-COP and Youth for Climate meetings. Thanks for joining us as we walk down this path to climate action, this road to Glasgow.